Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? It's been just over a year since Robert F. Kennedy Jr. stood before a raucous crowd at the Desert Diamond Arena in Glendale, Arizona, and asked, "Don't you want a president who's going to make America healthy again?" And with that, the MAHA era began. On this show, we've explored MAHA's mistrust, frustrations, contradictions, aspirations, setbacks, and successes. We've interviewed dozens of MAHA supporters and tried to understand how impactful the movement actually is. Today, we're shifting gears, and we're talking data. We're going from the qualitative to the quantitative, with answers to many questions we've had since the beginning. For starters, how big is the MAHA movement? We've heard some critics dismiss it as a tiny group that's getting way too much attention, a flash in the pan. Spoiler alert, if that's what you think, you might want to sit down for this episode. Also, just how popular is the MAHA agenda among all Americans? Is MAHA changing America's views? School lunches and food dyes are one thing, but what about on vaccines? On holding chemical companies accountable? What's the MAHA issue that resonates the most with all Americans, regardless of party affiliation? And how does the country as a whole feel about Kennedy? Today, a brand new poll. We'll talk to the pollster who designed it, and we'll be joined by a friend from MAHA, too. The numbers are in, y'all, so let's get started. Hello!
Welcome, everybody.
Y'all, we have been waiting forever to do this episode. No one was more excited about this new poll from the folks at Navigator Research than us.
We've been making up numbers this whole time, and now it's great. We've got numbers.
We've just been making shit up. Look, there have been so few polls on the MAHA movement and its agenda, nailing down the basics. How big is this movement? How does its issues resonate with all Americans? I mean, we've had really great conversations with supporters of the MAHA movement, but to dive into some numbers is like, man, we're so excited to do that. So a lot to get to, but first, who are we? I'm Brenda Adhikari.
Hey, I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Mark.
Yeah, as you know, Maggie's a virologist at Hopkins, Mark's a physician and a medical reporter, and Brenda and I are journalists. If you're new to us, we're a podcast that looks at the breakdown in trust in public health, medicine, and science, and we do that all through statistics only. That's it.
Yeah.
We are a numbers show. Just today.
Just today.
We're
Sorry,
all
right.
about
Just
numbers.
today.
But before we get into those numbers, we want to welcome an old friend to the podcast, as well as a newcomer to the show. Our old friend, Aaron Everitt, who is a supporter of the MAHA movement. Hi, Aaron. How's it going?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Good to see you. And also, Erica Seifert, who is with us from Navigator. Hi, Erica.
Good morning. It's nice to be here.
Aaron is a video journalist, a writer, and a substacker for Besides the Revolution, a great stack, and a writer for prominent MAHA influencer Jessica Reed Krause's newsletter House in Habit. Aaron was a volunteer for the Kennedy presidential campaign. And Erica Seifert is a polling expert and senior director at Navigator Research, the outfit that just put out this one-of-a-kind survey of MAHA and its impact. So we're psyched to have them on, and we'll get to them in a minute. So guys, just hang out for a little bit. Tom, why don't you help us with a little bit of context? Just give us a lay of the land before we get to our guests.
Yeah, we're super psyched to have these numbers finally. It's been a challenge. I mean, MAHA is tricky to understand and sort of decipher all the different parts of it. There's just many factions under one big movement. One is all about ultra-processed foods. Another's about vaccines and pharmaceuticals. And, number one issue there is the mRNA vaccine. A third focuses more on the environment, like pesticides and pollution and forever plastics. And that's sort of just the surface. I mean, this movement is thriving in social media. It's thriving in state houses across the country. And, a lot of people say MAHA's like nothing we've seen before. So we, of course, racked our brains to find a parallel back in American history. And there's one that kind of works from about 100 years ago, and that's the progressive era. So this is early 20th century. And the progressives fought against like meat packers selling bad food, medicine companies selling, dangerous cures. They were against industrial polluters, poisoning air and water, and they really were taking on monopolies. Every monopoly that's putting profit over health, over safety of workers. So that's food, drug safety, pollution, anti-big business monopolies. Sort of sounds familiar. Progressives lost faith in the Gilded Age. MAHA's lost faith in our age. So MAHA is like progressive era times. It's like a spicy soup. There's lots of people, lots of priorities, lots of cooks. And to torture that metaphor a little bit more, it really is sort of a nourishment for a whole lot of people, a whole lot of Americans who have just lost trust in our institutions, our government, corporate America. But we've been wondering just how many Americans. And that's the question that we're going to get at today.
I mean, if we're going to talk soup, I just have to say there's nothing worse than cauliflower soup.
Mark.
And I don't know why anybody would eat anything that smells like that. But let's get to polling. Back in December, YouGov, we talked about it a little bit before on the show, put out a poll. And it asked a basic question: what health-related subjects that they thought were very important for the government to focus on? And it's almost like our politicians take cues from like surveys, right? So we're going to talk a little about MAHA today and what we learned in a survey. But topping the list at number one was food safety. We've heard it here. We don't want the dyes. All of that seems to be like an easy win. What was next was air and water quality. Like that's the second highest priority. Wow. We've talked so much about chronic disease, and that list of like 12 or 13 things, that was number 9. And, even though we think vaccines is such a hot topic, that was second to last.
Wow.
12th place.
So this is after the election, before Trump 2.0, before Kennedy is sworn in. It's this kind of this interim period.
Yeah. This was back in December.
Those were our priorities.
Yeah.
Got it.
And if you're wondering what was last place, it's reproductive health, by the way. But what it shows is
nuts.
What it shows is just how much MAHA has changed this conversation about health in America all pretty rapidly in less than a year. We're going to get into it today, but we didn't really have polling on MAHA until now. This past week, the Kaiser Family Foundation did come out with one. It was fielded the day after that Tylenol press conference, that Don't Take Tylenol conference. And they found that 41% of Americans approve of the job that Secretary Kennedy is doing, and 59% disapprove.
Yeah, Mark, I was really interested in looking at their polling data on how people feel about Kennedy's vaccine policies, because that's become such a central topic. And 37% of Americans actually approve of his handling of vaccine policy, with 62% that disapprove. And there's a big divide, unsurprisingly, by party, where 69% of Republicans approve of his vaccine policies, compared to 32% for independents and only 12% of Democrats approving.
Yeah, Maggie, I mean, I think you're hitting on something that we're going to see, that a lot of these numbers, definitely vary by your political leanings. But the Kaiser Family Foundation poll also tried to get at this thing that we've been craving, which is how big is MAHA? Who are these people? Where are they? How many are there? They found that 43% of Americans, so 43% of all Americans, said they support the MAHA movement. But if you tease that out a little bit, it does break down. It's largely Republicans, and especially MAGA supporting Republicans. And they did say that only about 20% of MAHA supporters are Democrats, and no true MAHA supporter eats cauliflower soup.
And that's the key distinction.
But 43% of Americans support the MAHA movement. That's bigger than we thought. About right? Smaller? I think that's bigger than I thought.
That's bigger than I thought.
Yeah.
That's about what I thought, right? Because if you just look at the way that the election went, right? Who are these people?
Yeah. But I mean, there's always been this like MAGA and MAHA were a political marriage to get Trump elected. MAGA's not really into the MAHA issues. I think that's blown out of the water now.
Well, I'll just say this, which is, I think what I'm really interested to get into with Erica is like, how is that question asked and how is it understood by people, right? Because if you just say the MAHA movement, what does that mean to people? I'm interested.
Well, even better, Erica's got her own ways of measuring that and teasing that out.
Yeah, the Navigator poll is a little different than KFF.
Yeah.
Aaron, does that number surprise you? The 43% say that they support the MAHA movement?
No, I mean, it didn't surprise me. I think it was something, I actually thought it might feel a little bit low, honestly, kind of given the demographics of what actually we saw within the campaign, the numbers of people who were Democrats, Republicans, and how their support would go. Ultimately, by the kind of before the first debate, the sort of the one where we all found out that Joe Biden had been not alive, for so long. I know. It's so hard to remember.
Which debate was that? I don't even know what you're talking about, Aaron.
Yes, I know. It's so strange. But in that particular debate, Kennedy was moving into the 15, depending on the poll and depending on the state, you were seeing 15 to 20% of support for him. And that demographic within the poll that we did internally as a campaign, you saw that 6 in 10 of those people were Trump people and 4 in 10 of those people were Democrats. And so we sort of saw that breakdown within our own movement, I guess, for lack of a better word. I'm not at all shocked that it's a bigger movement than anybody's given it credit for. I think it is something that in American politics will have to be discussed from here on out.
Well, yeah. So that's a great segue into bringing our guest in, Erica Seifert. Erica, you are the mastermind of this brand new poll all about MAHA from Navigator Research. And we have so much that we want to get into with you. But look, first, since the focus of our podcast is all about trust, I do want to talk about Navigator itself, which is a progressive polling firm. So basic question. Why should our listeners trust your poll?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at Navigator, we're focused on the most pressing issues of the day, digging into what matters to Americans, from health and wellness to the cost of groceries. And sometimes that cuts in the direction for progressives and sometimes it cuts against, progressives. And my job is to tell the truth, because ultimately it doesn't help progressives if I'm, not telling them the truth. And so that's really what I see my job is as a professional listener. So we do focus groups, we do surveys, and we tell the truth no matter where the chips fall. And that's why I love digging into issues that progressives don't usually dig into, like, for example, MAHA.
So Erica, let's dig into it. We talked about KFF coming up with that 43% Americans support MAHA. What was your top line analysis of that support? Like, what did you guys learn?
Yeah, we asked a similar question, but one of the things that we learned in the focus group is when you just ask if you're a supporter of MAHA, the way folks in the focus groups, these focus groups were of folks that we call MAHA curious. And we didn't cut that by whether or not you consider yourself a supporter of MAHA. Instead, we asked about a series of issues and whether you agreed with them. Because when in the focus groups they heard, would you call yourself MAHA? A lot of them heard that in a really political way, and that turned them off, because these aren't folks who see themselves as primarily political. And I think one of the things, Kennedy, before he was in the administration, one of the things that he was capturing, really lightning in a bottle, was a real frustration with healthcare in this country. And that wasn't political for folks, right? Their entry point is food for a lot of these folks. It's, why are these dyes in our food? They're not in the food in other countries. And so in order to depoliticize it, what we did was we asked a series of questions and whether you agreed or disagreed. And we found that was a better way to really capture the full scope of the MAHA movement. So we found 11% are what we call MAHA loyalists. These are folks who agreed with all of the questions that we asked, and I can talk about what they are if you want. And then we have these MAHA curious folks. So if you look at them in terms of folks who are not partisans, it's 20%. But if you include the true group, including folks who are strong partisans, it's 44%. So folks who are MAHA curious and MAHA loyalists, that's 55% of people. And then we have these institutionalists, and these are folks who are all in on traditional healthcare views, right? They trust doctors, they trust vaccines, etc. But it's a huge portion of the population who are at least, curious about some of these alternatives, right? So there's questions like, American institutions have not always told the truth when it comes to health and wellness. I prefer to do my own research rather than defer to doctors. Our healthcare system is designed so drug and insurance companies make more money when Americans are sick. Some of these things are common sense to a lot of folks at this point, and it's caused them to really turn against what we would call traditional views on health and wellness in this country.
Mm-hmm. So how big was the institutionalist, the guys that are like, I am full on traditional establishment medicine, public health. What percent was that?
Yeah, that's 46%. And it adds to 101 just because of rounding.
Okay, I got you. So just to go back, you ask a series of questions to tease out, rather than going straight through the front door, you tease out through a series of questions where these folks stand. And you categorize about 11% as MAHA loyalists, full-on MAHA.
All in on all the questions.
And 44% are MAHA curious. Yep. They wouldn't, if you walked up to them in the park, they may say either, yes, I'm with MAHA, or if you have a conversation with them, you really get the sense that they are open to MAHA.
Well, so
leaning to MAHA. Just go into what curious means exactly, because that's a huge percentage, 44% of Americans.
This is why we wanted to do the focus groups with the MAHA curious folks. So if they're MAHA curious and they call themselves Republican, they might say, yeah, sure, I'm MAHA. But we excluded partisans from these focus groups because when you take partisanship out of it, you really get the full texture of what it means to be MAHA curious, because they don't think about health and wellness as something that's political. It's really personal to these folks, but they are definitely interested in getting their health information online, for example. They are doing their own research, but they're checking it with their doctor, for example. They are interested in supplements, but like really the entry point for these folks is food. This is how a lot of them got into it, was food policy. They're like, there's something going on here and it's not right. And once that door is opened, they got into a lot of other things. But when you exclude strong partisans, vaccines were not really the entry point for these folks. That's a lot more controversial. But food, the environment,
food dyes,
food dyes for sure. Even chemicals in food. They're even talking about, why are there all these preservatives in our food? Why does one of the people in our focus group said, food in this country doesn't go bad. Like food is supposed to go bad. That's a problem.
I want to and I'll say one more thing and I'll shut up. But Aaron, I'm just curious for you, does that track that people who are MAHA curious, they're not necessarily on the Signal chat, they're not going to the events, but they're MAHA curious, they're leaning, that food, broad topic, but food is sort of an entry point rather than concern, worry, opposition to vaccines. Does that feel right to you?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly where most people start in this conversation. They can't help but look down at their waistlines and go like, what happened to me? And I didn't feel like this was something and if you even look back and even in your most recent memory, it's not that Americans, we weren't this oversized. So it's kind of, I think that's where people really start, is sort of the gateway into this conversation. And frankly, I mean, I think that's really the part of, the vaccine thing was a very big deal to a lot of people who are really into that particular conversation because they've either been injured or harmed by it, or they didn't like how the response was to COVID in terms of the force and sort of authoritarian conversations that they felt about mandates. But that's a smaller group of people. Most people, have a very positive view of vaccines. They look at them and say that they're good and that they do what, polio and measles and all the things that they've...
Most people, underline that. Most people that you find in your MAHA conversations, your MAHA groups, have a positive view of vaccines.
Yeah, I would say, and at least if they're on the curious side of it, and particularly the people that kind of came in from the Trump world, it was, you could even hear it in Trump's stuff. Like even Trump himself still thinks that vaccines are really a critical component to American health. I mean, he talks about it. He talks about, even at a press conference that drives a lot of MAHA people nuts, talking about, how great Pfizer is and some of those things. That is a real thing. I think it's a real aspect of American perception on health, which is that vaccines are a part of it. I say, like, with the people that are the diehards, the 11% that I think Erica found in her poll, those people would say, absolutely not. Like, I don't want anything to do with them. I don't want them in my kids. I don't want to do anything. Or even more nuanced than that, and I think that might be a bigger number, would be people who say, I want to make that decision myself, and I actually don't want policy involved with mandates. That
Aaron,
number might be bigger.
I'll just jump in to say, I think it's interesting you say that, because from a leadership and a media perspective, I think it would really surprise people to learn that vaccines isn't the driving issue, even inside the movement. Because from Bobby Kennedy to so many leaders, they talk about vaccines a lot. So to me, that indicates that there is a powerful group within the MAHA movement and perhaps influential, that the vaccines issue is very important, and it's important to kind of keep them satisfied. Do you feel like I'm kind of hitting the mark with that, or what do you think?
I mean, I think media does its job to make sure that it's very always in the most contentious of spaces and the most controversial thing. That's what media does. It sells things, and it's a sales whore. That's what media is. And I think on some level, that's what's going to happen. You're going to get the conversations around vaccines and some of the things that are frustrating for people, or like this really contentious big issue. And I think and if you really back your way into how Kennedy even got here, this conversation starts like 20 years ago in his life in relationship to toxins in the water, and then also that correlation between toxins in the water and toxins in vaccines and those sort of mercury-driven things. That was where this started for him. So yeah, it's a driving force within it, and it's certainly a driving force within Kennedy, but he's also a pretty good politician. At the end of the day, he started with the thing that was the most achievable, which was food and food dyes and stuff that people did resonate with. That's where he started in this thing. And I think if you really looked at the overall total of what he's talked about in his time in the administration, you'd find that it's a lot less about vaccines. I mean, there's a lot of people in the MAHA world who say he doesn't talk enough about it.
Yeah, Erica, let's get into a little bit about who these people are, but just a few nuts and bolts things, because I think it's important to remember, how do you trust this survey? First of all, are these all comers? Who is it? A random sample? Do you tell us how you find these people? Who are they?
Yeah, I don't go out on the street and find them. So polling has moved beyond door knocking. This is a panel survey, right? And so it is weighted to be representative of registered voters. So we weighted on a number of factors: education, age, race, gender, etc. So it is reflective of the American population.
And is it when you ask the question, because everything is so political, like if you ask the question, are you a MAHA supporter? Do you say MAHA, or do you say, do you support Make America Healthy Again? And what do you learn if you ask it differently?
Yeah, we asked it both ways. So we asked MAHA, and then in parentheses, Make America Healthy Again. And then we also asked this in focus groups, and we said, would you call yourself, in the women's group, we said, would you call yourself a MAHA mom? And then what does that mean to you? This is part of the reason why we do focus groups, is because when you can ask something on a survey and think that you're asking it one way. And then in focus groups, you really tease out what are people hearing when I ask this question this way? And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to me to continue to do qualitative research, because, then we find out, what are people hearing when we ask this? And so one of the things that we learn in focus groups is you really do have to define it. When people hear MAHA, their first association was actually MAGA, right? And so that's one of the ways that we know, right? MAHA has become politicized in this way. That said, when we say, what does MAHA believe in? Their first associations are actually the positive things, food. And so that's really interesting. So they're not the MAHA curious are not identifying themselves as MAHA because they feel it's too political, but their first association isn't vaccines. Their first association is the food stuff that they agree with. And so it's, they're seeing it two ways. One, I'm not going to call myself this because it's become political. But two, I agree with a lot of the stuff that's going on around the food stuff that at the top of the focus group, I told you was really important to me.
Yeah. I mean, your poll mentions that MAHA's goal of making Americans healthier is admirable, but that, if we're talking about just this MAHA curious sector, some of the MAHA's tactics and political associations create hesitancy among the MAHA curious. Can you unpack what actually creates hesitation? Is it the way the message is delivered? Is it the messenger? Is it the policy position? What is creating hesitancy?
Yeah, so these are folks who, when we look at the MAHA curious, in particular, if we remove strong partisans, these are folks for whom, health and wellness it's personal, it's important, it's about their kids, right? Nothing is more dire and important. And when something becomes about a political show, that does turn them off, right? It's about politics. It's about something that's not about me protecting my family. But the goals of getting food dye out of our food, that is about me protecting my family. And then one of the things that we found, just to put a very specific point on this, is we're tracking Kennedy's favorability numbers, for example. And then we saw that after his hearing on Capitol Hill, his numbers declined, right? And so when they're putting a face to this that feels very political, that feels politically aggressive, that doesn't feel like it's about protecting them, then you see those numbers decline. That doesn't mean that support for these specific policies is declining, because that remains incredibly popular. But in particular, when we're talking about like the vaccines or in the focus groups, we did the focus groups right after the Tylenol stuff, those things are quite controversial.
So just sticking on that Kennedy bit for a second, help us parse that out. That is like a total number that I think is like his net is negative, right? But how does that break down by your loyalist, your curious, your institutionalists?
Yeah, exactly as you would expect, right? So the MAHA loyalists, and again, this is driven as well by partisanship, because the MAHA loyalists, right, tend to be conservative. 61% would call themselves MAGA Republicans, right? And so they're bought in. And then, of course, the institutionalists, they tend to be liberal. 64% of them voted for Kamala Harris, right? And so that cake was already baked before you even asked the question about Kennedy. And that's where this MAHA curious swing group falls, right? But they are more politically disengaged. When you introduce politics into something as important to them as health and wellness, right? It becomes a little bit tainted. And we really heard this in the focus groups, right? When they're talking about what's wrong with health insurance in this country, that becomes a challenge for them when it becomes tainted by politics and greed and things like that.
Erica, there's something really interesting that Aaron said, which, he said you got the loyalists, but then you have this infusion of Republicans who are now sort of moving into the MAHA space. And I was looking at your poll and thinking a lot about how MAHA was changing the Republican Party. But it struck me the way Aaron said that maybe in some ways the Republican Party is changing MAHA just by flooding with numbers. But I just want to dig into some really interesting findings about, I think you called them like value statements. And you guys got some really interesting findings here, at least they were to me. You found, correct me if I got this wrong, but you found that 77% of Republicans today believe that healthcare is a human right, that good healthcare is a human right. 77%. Do I have that right?
Yeah, this is absolutely incredible to me. And I think both things are true, right? I think MAHA is changing the Republican Party, right? And I think the reverse is true as well. But these numbers were absolutely staggering to me. I have been a pollster for almost 20 years, and these numbers blew my mind. So 77% of Republicans say healthcare is a human right.
I mean, that's like Bernie Sanders language, or
Absolutely.
Anybody who lived through the Obamacare fights. That was...
Yes.
I'm not sure I've ever heard a Republican politician say that phrase.
No. Well, there's more. 83% say that we should, this is the Republicans, sorry. I need to preface this again because this is blowing my mind. 83% of Republicans say that we should hold corporate polluters accountable. 81% of Republicans say that we should tax corporations that pour chemicals into our air and water.
What?
8 and 10.
80% of Republicans say we should introduce new regulations on corporations to prevent them from pouring chemicals into our air and water. So there's no way to say that MAHA has not fundamentally changed the way that Republicans respond to these things. So now we have bipartisan huge majorities, right? These are overwhelming. We can't get 80% of Republicans and Democrats to agree that the sky is blue right now, but like over 80% now agreeing on all of these things. There's no way to say that MAHA hasn't fundamentally change.
I mean,
and Democrats believe that as well still?
Yes. So huge.
So it's agreement.
Yeah. So someone should look at these data and say, we have huge bipartisan majorities of Americans saying these things. Someone, Democrats, Republicans in Congress, should do something about this, because this is what the American people want. And this is why I'm a pollster, right? Is like to be the voice of the American people. Someone should do this. This is because there's the American people have now come to an agreement on these things, but there's got to be political will somewhere to do these things. This is incredible.
Yeah.
Right?
Let me go. Hey, Aaron, you had a thought you wanted to jump in with.
Well, yeah, a couple things. I mean, I totally think that's accurate. I mean, I can't even state how accurate that shift has become. You actually heard that through the campaign. There were people saying like, I can't believe I'm listening to a Republican talk about these things. And they were talking about whether it was war or whether it was healthcare, whether it was any of that. That there's a shift. There's a dramatic shift, and you actually have people coming alongside saying, like, we have something really fundamentally broken here. We need to address it. My question actually, Erica, was, have you done this kind of polling before with the similar questions related to healthcare like 10 years ago or 15 years ago? Because I am really super curious, because I don't know how you avoid the political kind of tainting of American health in the system we live in. So I'm curious if this is like something you've done before.
Yeah. So Americans are more frustrated now than they have. I haven't seen this kind of frustration since the like 07, 08, debates. So just to give you a little bit of more recent perspective, folks are more frustrated now with the American healthcare system than they were in 2020, right? And so if you think about where we were in 2020, this is, really concerning. So if you look at like people who are positive right now about the availability and affordability of healthcare in the United States, 39% say that they're positive. That's a, better than 10-point drop since the pandemic. Like, things are bad right now in terms of, and look, we heard this in the focus groups. It's hard to afford healthcare. It's hard to get a doctor's appointment. It's availability, it's affordability. Like this is a thing that is hard to access. And when you do, you feel grateful that you have it, but it's like, it's not great.
Right. It's a sinking thing. It strikes me that, and Aaron, I'd be curious about what you think, given these findings about regulations, about taxing corporate polluters. It feels like the EPA seems really out of step with this, like the current EPA and the current approach to business and current approach to industry. That feels kind of way out of step with these numbers right now. Like there's a deregulation at the EPA. HHS seems to be very much in step. We can talk about certain aspects of it, but EPA seems, under the Trump administration, seems to be out of step with these numbers.
Yeah, it's where the frustration's coming from for most Americans. I really believe this. I mean, I think most people are like, look, these institutions are there. They were designed and set up and established to do the very thing that all of this polling is telling you they're frustrated about, and they don't do it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there is some, I'm frustrated with those conversations too. I'm not like a heavy regulation guy by any means or manner, because I think it just squashes the little guy more than it does big business. Mm-hmm. But that's the brokenness in this system, which is like, if you can get a seat at the table, you can write your own rules. And that's what seems to have happened. And that's where the frustration is boiling over, both in medicine and I think in environmental stuff. I think people are like, look, I don't want this stuff around. Well, can we do something about it? Oh, yes. Well, let's make sure we have the EPA take a look at it. But the EPA is bought and paid for by the people that can get a seat at the table. So I'm not at all I don't look at everything that is – I'm not a monolith by any stretch of the imagination. I don't look at government and go, boy, just because my guy's in charge, everything's going great. I don't see it that way. I never have. I think there's lots to be skeptical about in government. And frankly, these numbers demonstrate that the American people are getting skeptical, which I'm like thrilled about. Wonderful. We can get finally to a place where we're asking the right questions about how we're doing this thing, because it's not working. Clearly, it's not working. 80% of Americans are saying it isn't working. So that's like, what do we do about that? It's good.
Yeah, Aaron, you mentioned a little bit about, we talk a lot about vaccines and why is that? But I think though, reason is because vaccines became a flashpoint for, something much bigger, kind of like what you're alluding to now, this like trust in science, trust in government. And the poll talks a little bit about that. I'm curious if there are some similar findings, Erica, on vaccines that were surprising. Like, for example, like I think the one poll talked about the defunding of mRNA research, and that was 26% support defunding the mRNA vaccines. Is that something that crossed party lines? Like, tell us a little bit about what you found in terms of the vaccines that was surprising.
Yeah, so it does become more partisan when we get into vaccines. So look, there's a lot of support, even bipartisan support, although it does, break down a little bit more by party. When we talk about the childhood vaccines, right? So the childhood vaccines that everyone had that were mandated, when we were children, there's continues to be a lot of support for those. It becomes a little bit more controversial when we think about the mRNA vaccines and mandating mRNA vaccines. But in terms of support for research, that continues to be high. And we heard this in the focus groups as well. If we want people to be healthier, then why would we, defund research, especially for like cancer, rare diseases, etc. That didn't come up unprompted in the focus groups, but when we asked folks, they were like, well, the answer to being healthier is certainly not defunding research. But one thing that we are hearing a lot, and this was true in the survey and the focus groups, is more openness to choice. Instead of, mandates, a little bit more openness to choice rather than the childhood vaccine mandates that we had. But when we did ask about the Florida vaccine mandates, we did find overwhelming opposition to that. So,
wait, say that. Be overwhelming opposition to what?
To letting people, to ending public school requirements to take vaccines to attend, right?
Yeah, so we asked that in a very timely way. So that was ending vaccines in the childhood vaccines in Florida. And that was not, folks did not support that. So there is a conversation going on about vaccines where folks are a lot more open to choice than they would have been, 10 years ago. And this is for sure a function of, MAHA saying, should we be required to put vaccines in our arms? But there is a big difference between the traditional childhood vaccines and mRNA vaccines that folks feel are less tested, that are new, and they're more skeptical of. Part of this, I suspect, given what we heard in the focus groups about how much information they're getting online, is that this is a conversation that is happening in social media spaces, right? They're hearing a lot about mRNA vaccines on social media. Look, this is near universal in these focus groups, that they're getting a lot of their health information online in really interesting ways, right? So we heard someone say, I hear something on TikTok, I fact check it on ChatGPT. Lots of folks saying, I hear about this thing on Instagram, but then I go fact check it with my doctor. So they're not like leaving their doctors behind, but they're getting a lot of information from social media. It's a completely new way of getting health information.
Aaron, I want you to wrestle with this because it's just fascinating. There was one number that found Republicans, 59% of Republicans agreed with the statement that we'd be better off if we used fewer drugs and relied more on traditional medicines. And then there was another number that found 43% of Republicans said they were more inclined to be skeptical of vaccines than to trust them. Do you feel, how do you wrestle with those numbers? There's sort of like a fear. There's a feeling that we're over-relying, but then Erica tells us Republicans are not down with public schools ending requirements to get vaccinated for kids to go to school. Like, how do you make sense of that? Like, what's going on there?
Well, I don't think you can just jump right into the conclusion. I mean, this is a massive shift in the window in terms of even having this conversation. I think most people, and I was going to ask Erica that. I mean, if you looked at these numbers 10 years ago or 15 years ago, what was the difference in how people saw hesitancy? And I think it's like all things in politics. You have to move the conversation. And I think one of the pieces about this conversation around vaccines is that this has been the fait accompli of all things in medicine, which is that there's a pharmaceutical solution for all ailments. And I think that's where but the fact that we actually look at ourselves and go, I don't feel healthy and I don't seem right, and this doesn't seem like it's going the right way. Can I ask bigger, broader questions about all things within medicine, including vaccines? I think that's what's maybe happening. And I'd be curious, I think that's how I wrestle with this is, I know what I think about it. I know what we've done with our children, and I know what we are, planning on proceeding forward in relationship to these kind of industrial or pharmaceutical solutions. We're not giant believers in them personally, but we also, I recognize fully that from an American narrative, this is how medicine has been done since, early 20th century. So you're not going to unwind that in a second. And you do see victories in that for people. Like polio was celebrated tremendously as like that vaccine was a tremendous success, and people saw it with measles. And so I think, and most people don't want their children to go through those kind of heavy things. So I think there's some sense that people are like, look, I'm not totally down with just letting all things be open and wild. We're not looking for that. And I think that's just because most people haven't had this conversation in front of them. And this is the first time in any time that we're having this conversation is in the last year. It's not even, you can't even have this conversation in media. It's been shut down. It's been not a thing that you ask. So I think it's actually an indicator, and I'd be curious what Erica says from the past, because I think actually the window's moving.
There's no way to tell you what these poll numbers were in the past because we would not have thought to ask.
You wouldn't have asked them
10 years ago.
So that would be an answer, I guess.
Exactly. The most telling thing to tell you is we would not have asked this question 15 years ago. We would never would have asked.
When you say this question? What would we not have asked? I mean, we didn't suddenly become new creatures that we didn't think about personal choice and liberty and independence. And what is so novel here?
About ending childhood vaccines. Yeah. We would
mandates.
Yeah.
I'll give you a novel one too, Mark. They asked, are you nervous? Are you more nervous about the safety of things that you put in your body, food, vaccines, and medicines? Are you nervous about putting those things in your body? 33% of Democrats said they were nervous about putting things like that in their body. 54% of Republicans said they were nervous about that. To me, that, like to Aaron, it's like, I wish magically we go back in time and have a number on that. But like, I feel like Democrats were the party of the kind of left, anti-vaccine, crunchy, worried about food, worried about over-medicating. That has flipped now. Republicans, more than half of Republicans worry about putting things in their body like food, vaccines, and medicines.
But what about the progressive era that we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Like, right, that they were worried about stuff like that. Like, why is it?
And this gets to a bigger question, which I think is kind of interesting with what Erica and her outfit are doing. The progressive area was not owned or aligned with just one party. Mm-hmm. It bubbled up into not just Republicans, Teddy Roosevelt, not just Democrats like Woodrow Wilson, but sort of independents when Teddy Roosevelt runs as independent. So it's like, it was not so political. These things about fear, about pollution, about drug safety, about food, they were sort of slightly apolitical. They would go where they could get things done. And I kind of feel like that speaks to the whole sort of bigger picture of what Erica's kind of firm is doing here, which is this doesn't have to be one party. This could be Democrats doing it. It could be independents grabbing onto things here. Like, Erica, am I right? Is that sort of the bigger picture for you?
Yeah, that is the big picture for me. And I think there's a huge opening here for Democrats to talk about things that people really care about, right? Democrats are having a big healthcare conversation right now. Well, this is a healthcare conversation that people are having every day at their kitchen tables. This is something that matters a great deal to people, is what they put in their bodies. But it's also about like what the government cares about. The most popular thing on this survey was people having access to fresh fruits and vegetables, right? Being able to afford healthy food is something that we all should care about in terms of how we're, making our country and keeping ourselves healthy. And some of these things feel so common sense that I think there's a frustration that we can't, as this incredibly big, amazing country, can't make it happen, right? How are we not able to help ourselves be healthy? These things feel really, really common sense. It should be easier for every American family to access fresh fruits and vegetables. The government should make it more affordable for American families to stay healthy. That feels socialist. 76% of Republicans agree with that. 84% of 92% of Democrats and 85% of independents. This is across the board majorities wanting these things. So yes, I would say there's a huge opening here for someone to expand the conversation on what healthcare means in this country and how we afford it and how we keep our families healthy.
Erica, I'm also just struck by something when I listen to some of these numbers, going back to something Aaron was saying, that, when it comes to something like vaccines and the broad support that the country continues to have for the childhood vaccines and even the schedule and even the requirements, it gets at something I've heard from many MAHA supporters, which is, when it comes to even somewhat of a defense of some of these drastic transformations of the federal government right now and cuts, which is like the people want this, right? They voted for this. And I think I would just say to the MAHA movement that the people like vaccines. Like, if we're going to go by the logic of like the people, like, let's hear the people and what they're saying. Repeatedly, since Kennedy has become director of HHS, they've been polled over and over again. And sure, there's maybe been erosion and the mRNA is its own kind of thing. But when it comes to childhood vaccines, I think people would be very upset if those things, if trust was kind of continually eroded in them. Aaron, tell me what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I think I'd just add one piece to that, which is, yes, I think they're popular and part of our American ethos in terms of how we see medicine happening. But I think one of the things that is okay, and I think it's a good movement generally across the board, is to add a little bit of skepticism, add a little bit of depth to our processes within the medical world. We've talked about this before. I feel terrible for doctors who seem to have like 7 minutes with their patients, and then this becomes the solution. And this is like the only solution is the fast one, which is a pharmaceutical one. It's not a conversation about health and well-being and mental health and all the other stuff that's a part of that. I guess I would just say, yeah, they are popular, certainly amongst people. Part of that is because the conversation is so brand new. And so I think it's okay. And I think it's okay to give Americans permission to ask that question. And sure, maybe we will find that some of these are the right thing, and some of them are things we probably ought to have a little skepticism and reservation about, including mRNA. I think that's an okay thing for people to have that conversation about, because it's a longer form dialogue about what American health actually should become and what it should look like. And what I think the poll is actually indicating, if I'm reading deeper into it, is that there is a general dissatisfaction with the American healthcare system, both economically and in its procedures and how it's treated and how it's administered. And that to American people is like, I'm done. I've had enough. So I'm going to ask some questions about this. And if somebody's actually willing to open that Pandora's box and ask that question, I might listen to him for just a second here and see what has to happen. So yeah, I think it's a popular thing currently. I think the mandate thing in Florida being removed is something that people are like, wait, whoa, I don't know, because it's moving really quickly. Again, that's people with inside baseball, right? Are like, let's get this done. And they're really happy with that thing because they have what they believe to be the data that's accurate on it and all those things and all the things that are happening for them that have said, we need to get better questions asked. And until we have those questions asked, let's put the brakes on and stop some of this stuff with mRNA. I don't know that all the people are there yet, but again, that's American politics.
Yeah,
you gotta move
I think
it.
that.
Aaron,
sorry.
you just you got us all fired up. Let's go, Dr. Mark, and then Maggie.
Aaron, I think you said something that I was wondering if, Erica, you found anything in the survey to support something that Aaron said, because I think there is something here about the economics of all of this. And are we really conflating this idea that we don't like our healthcare system when it's just too expensive, or it's just unexpected, deductibles or whatever. Is there anything about this like MAHA message that's tapping into the economics of this? And we're just kind of like lumping it all into like ideology when it's really just like, I can't afford this.
Yeah, I would say the starting point is frustration with the American healthcare system, and this was clear from jump in the focus groups, right? That, the healthcare system is hard to access, it's hard to get appointments, but I do want to just differentiate here. That doesn't mean a lack of trust in my specific doctor, right? So yes, it's hard to get an appointment, but I may be getting some health information from WebMD or TikTok, but I'm going back and fact checking it with my doctor who I trust, right? And so they're sort of straddling this line here between like the traditional formal healthcare system, and then there's a real line here between my doctor that I trust, who's a person, and the insurance companies that are really causing a problem for me. A lot of these folks in our focus groups gave a lot of texture to this frustration that we're seeing in the survey with the healthcare system is inaccessible and unaffordable. But I did just want to get back to vaccines for 1 second, just to put a number on it.
Always back to vaccines.
Sorry. But like even among MAHA loyalists, when you look at the measles vaccine, okay, the measles vaccine is favorable among MAHA loyalists by 20 points. The coronavirus vaccine is unfavorable among MAHA loyalists by 80 points. So it's negative 80 among MAHA loyalists.
Right.
Measles vaccine, positive 20.
So it's a net
20.
Net negative 80. So that means if you ask all the MAHA loyalists, do you support the mRNA vaccine or the COVID vaccine?
Yep.
And you took all that say, I support it, and you subtracted all who say,
yep,
I don't support it, you'd come out minus 80. So,
but the measles vaccine, positive by 20. And this is where
nobody wants measles.
Right. But this is where I think some of the policies are getting ahead of even where the base is, right? The MAHA loyalists here, this is the base for these things, right? And even among this base, the measles vaccine is positive, net plus 20. And so I think when we think about the vaccines and things that people grew up with, they know are safe, there's a real distinction here. And so I would just caution about getting ahead of, where even the base is, because that's just the base, right? That's not even all Americans.
I think that nuance is really important to underscore and understand. And I really liked that the survey broke out those different categories because, you're right. There is different perceptions of different vaccines. And it's something I think we could have done better on the science side, explaining how mRNA technology works, how that timeline was shortened. But that's for another episode. I wonder if we might dig into another piece of data that I found fascinating, which was the split on birth control. So about 41% of Republicans and 33% of MAHA curious said they thought hormonal birth control methods are very damaging and natural alternative methods are just as efficient compared to 70% of Democrats. Can you talk a little bit more about other findings around that?
Yeah, we learned a lot about this in the focus groups. We were really curious about this. And what we learned is this is a conversation that has sparked online. So a lot of folks are getting this from conversation. They're getting this from social media. So this is information that is sparking online, and they have a lot of questions about it. And then a lot of young women are going to their doctors and asking about it. Some of them getting the answers they want, some of them not getting the answers that they want. But this is a real conversation that is happening among young women that they are getting on social media, and then making very different choices than they would have even, a couple years ago as a result of, the alternative sources of information. Like, this is one of the most important pieces to me about MAHA is where people get their health information from. And they feel like, doctors have pushed hormonal birth control and it's not good for our bodies. And there are other ways to do it. And this is, happening because there are other ways of getting health information now.
Aaron, I want to talk a little bit about something that you had said and try to figure out, like, how do we really move forward in real life? This MAHA discussion is all about data. And, I think we talk a lot about giving people more choice and having more skepticism towards doctors and more freedom from the system. And, how do we, do that? But as a doctor, like, sometimes the patients, they just don't talk like this. They do not talk like us right now. This is not what is happening in exam rooms. It's 2 a.m, you're in the ER, or you have a cancer diagnosis and you're right there with your doctor. Like, you just want like advice and strong guidance. And I don't know about MAHA loyalists versus MAHA curious. Like, I'm sorry, it's not real. It's not what I'm seeing. I mean, I know the MAHA movement is 43% of Americans say they support MAHA. I don't see that in my exam rooms. I just don't.
Why? Because people, they just don't raise these questions. When push comes to shove, like, what do you mean?
When push comes to shove, they're there for expertise. They want to know how I'm going to help them. They want to know what I'm going to cut out of their body. They want to know what medicine I'm going to prescribe. And I'm obviously in tune to this because I'm talking about it here on this podcast every week. And I'll even go there. With patients. And sometimes when I do go there, they're just overwhelmed. They're like, no, forget it. I can't deal with that. I can't deal with that.
I already know what Aaron's going to say to this.
Well, I want to know what Aaron's going to say. And then I want to know, Erica, did you get like a lot of just like raised eyebrows? Like, what the F are you talking about? Like, why are you asking me these questions?
Start with Erica's answer first.
So we didn't, but we recruited the focus groups based on people who were MAHA curious, right? They had screened for, seek alternative information, but, MAHA curious folks are a huge portion of the population. But we did hear a lot of folks say, I look up something on WebMD and then I go and ask my doctor about it, or I hear something on social media and then so I'm surprised that you're not getting, one woman said, I heard that mustard is a good cure for cramps, and then I'd talk to my doctor about it, or a good cure for something. And so a lot of folks, the men are really interested in supplements, for example. And so a lot of folks seeking these alternative solutions, non-pharmacological solutions, and either talking to their doctors about it or not. But a lot of folks are fact-checking with their doctors. So I'm surprised that folks aren't finding their own answers on WebMD and bringing it to you.
No, I'm not saying that exactly, but I'm saying just more about, like, let's get real for a second. Like, when you're sick, this is all great. Like, if you're healthy and you're preventive medicine and you're feeling good and you're just checking in, but like, I'm talking about when you're really sick, like the skepticism disappears like the moment illness gets real, is what I'm saying.
I think yes and no. So we had one person who said to us, I went to the ER, I got sent home, and then I got a call that was like, you have to come back. We made a mistake. There are some situations, some interactions with, formal medicine that have, sparked some skepticism, or, people will hear something in a doctor's office, they don't understand it, and then they go home and look it up. Right. And so I do think that they're, balancing between back and forth. But in terms of, do people still trust the expertise of doctors? Yes. And the survey says that, and our focus groups say that. When it comes to who do I trust, if it's between TikTok and my doctor, are they going to trust their doctor? Yes.
And also, Mark, don't you find that, like, it's like you're describing one arena, right, of where people think about their health, which is like in that crisis moment with their doctor. But I think what this poll is showing, at least to me, is, and if I'm Aaron, this is what I'm thinking if I'm Aaron, and then I'm going to let Aaron say what Aaron is thinking. But like, there's so many times we think about our health in this country, and it's not just in a doctor's office. And I think that when we're thinking about all those other times that we're thinking about health with our partners at the kitchen table, when we're just we have a headache at night or something, right? And we're not like with our doctor about like, do I cut a tumor off or not? Like, that's when some of the doubt starts creeping in, I imagine. Aaron, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's probably just the nature of your world, Dr. Mark, is that you're a doctor. You're in the middle of people's crises, and I think that's a real thing. I think that's normal. And I think at those moments when you're like in panic, you're going, I need somebody who's done more than me in this and my WebMD stuff. And so I think that's okay. And I think that's how this is supposed to be. I think there's supposed to be a natural relationship between doctor and patient. And I think there's something to that. I think what people are expressing generally in this and is that the system itself does not function in the way in which that relationship is maximized. It's very, very industrial. It's very, very moved through. And I think some of what you saw or what you just described, Erica, about like, hey, we got some information now, you got to come back. That happens more often than people want to admit. And I think that's the part where I think that it's like, just how do we answer that question? How do we get to that? It always comes back to economics. It always comes back to the fact that we really have a system that's broken from the insurance side of things. It's not helpful. The whole system is broken in that way. So everybody has to sort of participate in at a C grade level. That's not helpful to American health. And I think that's where some of the skepticism is coming in. And yeah, maybe in the moment you're not seeing it in the patient's room, but I think that's because like also the patients that are coming to the traditional doctors are disproportionately sick. They're people that are chronically in the doctor's office. They need to come and find another solution for things because they're sick and they can't get answers. So, and
I don't think we're really seeing it a lot in in much of the leaders of the MAHA movement discussion. I mean, we're not hearing about cost, access, the MAHA leaders are not talking about that. I would say with the one exception that we're talking a little bit about it is this idea of, trying to rein in prescription drug costs that we're hearing lately and some of these arrangements that we're making with pharmaceutical companies. But that seems to be like more of like, the White House angle than any of the MAHA leaders.
I mean, that kind of tees up a question I have, and it's more of just like a thought, and I'd be curious what Aaron and Erica think about, or anybody else, frankly. We saw news of, to Mark's point, the Trump administration standing up in the White House saying, we've cut a deal with AstraZeneca to get more affordable pricing for drugs that are sold to Medicaid. And we've done that with Pfizer. And there's these big press conferences where the CEOs of these big drug makers, stand there and handshake and happy times at the White House. And a lot of MAHA people, there was definitely a vocal group of MAHA people online that are furious about this. These are the enemies. What are you doing? This is the whole point. Why are you shaking hands with them? It seems to me that if MAGA is changing MAHA and diffusing, to some extent, the vaccine conversation, it seems to me that Trump really is the most important, factor here and how he feels about vaccines, because MAGA really takes cues from Trump. So if you've got Trump shaking hands with AstraZeneca and Pfizer, you got Trump getting a COVID booster, but then you have a different Trump at the Autism Tylenol press conference who's raising real questions and fears about vaccines and the childhood schedule and the Hep B vaccine.
He's not raising fears or asking questions. He's making directives. He
said, how about this? He's voicing his fears about vaccines and the vaccine schedule, spread it out, take the Hep B thing at age 12, not as a baby. Like, it's not 100% clear to me, like, where Trump is right now on vaccines. And it seems to me where Trump is on vaccines is super important for MAGA, and therefore is going to be super important for this entire thing that we're calling MAHA and where it goes with vaccines. I mean, Aaron, does that make sense to you? Am I connecting dots? Is this putting too much on Trump?
I think the best thing that could happen for any of this movement is to not have it be associated with Trump in any manner. He's so polarizing for so many people that even if the conversation is available for folks, they are not going to listen to it. I mean, I think this shift in what you saw of like the progressives from the early 20th century and being a part of this movement to why we're here, where the Democrats are institutionalists, has everything to do with the last 10 years, which is they just don't trust anything that Trump says. So they're going to move away. I mean, you saw that even in the 2020 world when there was this conversation about a vaccine being developed, you saw Democrats say, I will not get a vaccine if it's Trump's vaccine. Kamala Harris famously said that. There were people that said that early, and then you move to the other side of it. And by the time we get, he's not there, now everybody's like, okay, well, I'll get the vaccine because it's Biden's vaccine. So this is like a real weird polarizing factor. The conversation should be moving away from the characters if it can happen. And if that could happen, I think then the conversation actually will get to what Erica's seen in the polls, which is that there's actually something here that all Americans kind of want to resonate and get around. They just we're going to struggle to do it as long as it's character driven.
Well, I don't disagree that we should move away from leaders who disseminate misinformation. But I will say that the biggest movement that we have seen in terms of, vaccine, because Navigator has been tracking this over time, right? And so if you look at Democrats on the coronavirus vaccine, for example, plus 75, net plus 75, net plus 66, net plus 67, in our tracking. It's Republicans who have moved. And this is to your point about Trump's influence here. So as recently as January 2023, Republicans were net plus 7 on the coronavirus vaccine, now down to net minus 2 on the coronavirus vaccine. And so that's actually the movement we see in terms of Trump's influence. Democrats started positive, remain positive in terms of the coronavirus vaccine. He has had an influence on Republicans' views on this vaccine.
It would appear to show that the Democrat leaders have zero influence on their.
That's another way of looking at it.
This is the benefit of
the other thing that's happening here.
This is the benefit of Navigator having a long history of being able to track these things.
Yeah. Hey, Erica, are there any other findings that we've overlooked in this conversation that you want to highlight?
Like who is a MAHA loyalist? Like they paint that picture. I think you have some demographics and that was just interesting to me.
Yeah, on the fringes, right? The MAHA loyalists. And look, I don't know what this looked like a year ago or 2 years ago before Kennedy was so attached to Trump, but MAHA loyalists have really become MAGA. A huge portion of them are MAGA. And the institutionalists look a lot like Democrats. This is why the MAHA curious folks are so interesting to me, because they don't think about health and wellness primarily through a partisan lens. They're really coming at this through a health and wellness lens. And they are really interested in both these alternatives because they're frustrated with the healthcare system in this country. And they're interested in these alternatives, but they haven't shut the door on vaccines. They haven't shut the door on doctors. They haven't shut the door on some of these things that the institutionalists have really dug in on. And so I think that this is really where we're thinking about who is going to take up this mantle, in a non-political way. But I do think that, the Democratic Party has a real opening here, right? So the Navigator research shows a lot of these things are core Democratic issues, especially on the environment, on food safety, on regulation, on taxing polluters. These are core Democratic issues, and there's a real opening here for the Democratic Party. So, my advice to the Democratic Party would be there's an opening here on health and wellness. People are talking about this at the kitchen tables. They're talking about this on the internet. They're talking about it with their doctors. It's time for the Democratic Party to have a conversation with the American people broadly about what healthcare means.
I think that's really interesting. And I'll just say this as we start to wrap up. Aaron, to your point about how this poll is really making it clear that Americans are ready to have those tough conversations that are, things that are fueling their skepticism. They're getting more and more open to talking about it. I'd say, to Secretary Kennedy, to President Trump, to all the leaders right now, as much as we should be, elevating the conversation to people who are mistrusting the system and making sure that they're being heard, we should also bring in people who are trusting as well. The people who are sort of trusting the vaccine still and who are trusting, their doctors to give them information, to kind of give them a seat at the table too, because I'm just hearing from many of them that they're not really feeling quite let into the conversation, that that some of the policies being driven by people who are mistrustful. And so what would it look like if it truly were a bigger tent, that some of those people who are like, look, I totally hear you and I value and I want you to get heard. But I also want you to know how I feel about vaccines. And could that actually be a really fruitful conversation? I just kind of put that out there, Aaron.
Yeah, I think it's good to have a lot of voices at the table. I will say that the voices that are probably speaking the loudest in terms of MAHA at the moment are because that voice hasn't even been heard ever. And it's not been something since maybe the early 20th century that these conversations have even been allowed. So I think it's been something that's been so shut down. And as that all things happen, that when you kind of suppress that stuff, all of a sudden that voice gets, it blows up and it gets loud, and then people are ostracized out of the conversation because they've dominated the conversation for the last 100 years. And so they're going, well, like, we've tried your way, we're going to try our way. And but I do think ultimately at the end of this, the way to solve it is going to be something that is a hybrid of this conversation between some pharmaceutical industrialized medicine, because of the number of people that we have to deal with and the way the system works, but also this sort of preventative element that I think MAHA is asking better questions about in terms of that. I will say, to Erica's point about the Democrats, I agree that they have an opening. I don't think they'll ever take it. So.
Well, I would say, like, if Hakeem Jeffries were here, he'd say it's great to talk about ultra processed foods, et cetera, but if people don't have access to healthcare, preventative healthcare, they are so in the hole. So we've got to get the subsidies for ACA. We got to fight the Medicaid cuts, because if you can't access a doctor, it doesn't matter if you're eating a little bit healthier or exercising a little bit more, So
I mean, yeah, exactly. To say the Democrats aren't in tune with it, I mean, it's like why we have a government shutdown. I mean,
wait, but I'm kind of with Aaron on this one. We've as Democrats, I'll say we've, because you all know I've voted for Democrats in the past. In the past, the conversation has been about Medicare for all. It's been about the ACA. It's been about healthcare. I think what Erica's poll is showing, what the Navigator poll is showing, is that this is a much bigger conversation than just how you pay for insurance.
You're saying don't stop there, Democrats. Like,
that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying, yes, you have to stop these cuts to Medicaid and the ACA 100%. I would agree with that. But don't stop there, right? Have a bigger conversation about how to keep people well, because this isn't just about preventing, catastrophic illness. It's also about staying well. And I think that that's what people are trying to tell us.
And then the flip side is, can Democrats do that? Can they separate from the vaccine conversation and find common ground, or do they just bang their head against the wall because of the vaccine conversation?
No, you remember what Elizabeth Frost told us, right? When she called Democrats in her state house in Ohio to come to an event,
meet, right?
They wouldn't. Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. That's again, I'm speaking for Erica, but I imagine she's making the argument. There's a lot of common ground here to take advantage of. Stop just focusing on one thing that you disagree on and ruining this entire opportunity, right?
That is exactly what the Navigator survey suggests.
Right. And on that note,
look, I hope our listeners feel as satisfied as I do. Sometimes you just want information, and Erica just provided us with some really interesting data that really captures just a wide swath of this population. So a huge thank you to Erica Seifert from Navigator Research for joining us. Thanks, Erica.
Thank you so much for having me.
And for those of you who want to kind of pour into the stats and pour over the data yourself, we will put the links to the Navigator survey and the poll in our show notes. So check it out there. And also a huge thank you to Aaron Everitt, MAHA supporter, friend of the pod, been on the pod so many times. We love having you on, Aaron.
Thanks for having me. It's great. It's always fun. Great conversation.
That is our show for today. Please send us questions and comments to questions@whyshouldItrustyou.net. Also, if you like this podcast, can you suggest it and recommend it to people? Go on to wherever you find your podcast. Give us a rate, give us a like, give us a review, and check us out on Substack as well. I am Brenda Akari. He's Dr. Mark. He's Tom Johnson. She is Maggie Bartlett. We will see you right back here next week.